My name is Jennifer Gray-Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of Rebuild North Bay Foundation. This podcast is specifically designed to bring you people who have been through what maybe you have just gone through or that you are concerned about. We created the podcast How to Disaster to show you the breadth and depth of humanity in the midst of this really terrible thing that happened. I wanted to do this podcast so that I could bring some of the most amazing leaders that I've ever known in my life to you. You may have just experienced a disaster, and you may be looking around and you are dealing with trauma and the shock of it. And you may be wondering, I don't know how to do this part. And so we purposefully made this podcast into different sections and different topics of recovery so that you could pick and choose what would work for you at that time. So welcome to How to Disaster, and thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster. In this podcast, we try to help communities figure out how to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you people who've done really cool, effective things for their community. And today is a very proud day to bring you a person that I've been working with for about 2 years, whose name is Alma Bowen. Alma founded a group called Nuestra Comunidad. It's a nonprofit that serves vulnerable communities, primarily the Latinx and senior communities. She has been one of our major grantees over the past 2 years of her organization. We have given her support so that she can go into senior living communities and teach them how to build resiliency into their systems and really reduce the anxiety of that very vulnerable population. A big gap that Alma fills, though, in our community is with the Latinx population. You know, you really need people who are boots on the ground in every disaster. And one of the first rules of disaster is to ask the question, what do you need and how can I help? And if you do that, you'll actually serve the community that's in front of you. That's been a really big problem for the public sector and the nonprofit sector. I think that too often we actually serve the community we feel like serving as opposed to asking the community what they need and then directing our program and our funding streams from there. I really admired the fact that Alma gave up a career of 18 years with the Sonoma County Sheriff's Department as a dispatcher because she knew after the fires of 2017 that there was this huge gap of service in recovery and resiliency for our Latinx population and our seniors. She works really hard. It's definitely a grassroots startup nonprofit, and we've been very proud to support her. She pivoted easily during COVID because she was already had those relationships on the ground. And as she was learning COVID, she was also learning how to serve. We were very proud to help her and support her in that work. And at the same time, when I need something done right and done in Spanish, I turn to Alma. During COVID, when it opened, there was a little bit of a, a little bit of a lag time in getting things out in Spanish at the same time as English. This is something that should be in every single county, city, state, no matter what. If you have a population that speaks a language other than English, it's really important in your emergency services that you provide that information at the exact same time. You can imagine how scary it is to go through a disaster, and then double that if you're going through a disaster and you don't speak or read the language that all the information is coming into. We also know from working with the Latinx population and working with Alma that there are ways that are most appropriate to serve the population in front of you. We learned during 2017 during our wildfires, and we learned again during COVID. It's really important that if you want to serve the Latinx community, one of the things to look at is how to get information to them. It may not be in your traditional way. One thing we learned was fund PSAs on the radio. In our case in Sonoma County, we have people who speak Spanish and don't speak any English, and we have people who speak indigenous languages and don't speak Spanish or English. KBBF, in this case, run by the amazing Alicia Sanchez, serves those communities. And so instead of trying to recreate something for us, we found it better just to make sure that we were funding and supporting the communities and organizations that were serving those populations. So I asked Alma to come on here today to tell you her fire story and to talk to you about best practices for how to serve vulnerable communities, in particular seniors and Latinx. Thank you. So again, welcome Alma Bowen to How to Disaster. Alma, I would really like you to start today by telling the audience about your fire story. What were you doing the night of October 8th, 2017?
You know, that night is a point of reference that there was before the fire and then after the fire. And so the night of the Tubbs fire, I actually was, at that time, I was a 911 dispatcher. And so I was on a day off, or at least I thought it would be my day off, and I got called in. And so interestingly enough, I'd been there over 16 years, almost 17 at the time when this happened as a dispatcher. And we had what's called an all hands page. In the 17 years, I had never seen it. We've talked about it. We knew what it meant, but I had never seen it happen. That night, my phone went off with a page from the dispatch center with an all hands page. And I thought, uh-oh, somebody up there made a mistake and sent out this page, because what that page meant was literally all heck is breaking loose. Anybody that's not currently working needs to come into the center. So I put on my uniform and left the house thinking I'll be back home in a couple hours, or, you know, obviously something is happening, and walked into a night that changed my life forever. So I clocked in at 11 o'clock that night, was exactly my clock in time. And I worked all through the night and into the next day. And what was happening is that the Tubbs fire had just rolled over the hill into Sonoma County, into Santa Rosa area. And at the dispatch center, we were receiving thousands of calls literally from community members trying to figure out what was happening, trying to put their mind around this unbelievable fire that we were witnessing. And in the dispatch setting, it was really confusing because we were getting calls from all over the county. So from what we could see, it felt like the entire county was on fire, because they would jump literally from one area to the next without a connecting point. So it was like this firestorm was happening. And for the first time, as a lead dispatcher, as a communication center training officer, we were navigating an area that we had never trained to navigate. So we didn't have protocols in place. What do we tell people that are calling us that are completely surrounded in fire? What do we tell community members about evacuations? We all had to rely on our best instincts as seasoned dispatchers and respond to a circumstance we didn't fully understand. It literally was call after call after call. It's what it sounds like when a community is not prepared for a disaster. Everything from people just asking a question like, is there a fire? I smell smoke, to people saying, I'm completely surrounded in fire. How do I get out of here? And knowing,
if I may, one of the things that I would like the audience to hear is that, prior to this fire in 2017, we hadn't seen fire behavior like this. So not only was the county not prepared, but even CAL FIRE had not seen behavior like this. And it really ended up changing the entire scope of how they responded to wildfires. And most people did not have alerts on their phones. And so it was definitely an emergency situation, but in a way that was so unprecedented that that we have learned since then. But it was just, to think about the first responders, I hope that everyone also considers that dispatchers were first responders too, in uncharted territory when 11 fires broke out and 6,000 units of housing were burned on the first night alone. So I want to give context for people who don't know what happened here. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the magnitude of what was happening that night. There wasn't a precedence in how to fight the fire, but at the dispatch level, there wasn't a precedence in how to deal with the calls that were coming in. The fire was literally moving sideways. So to illustrate how confusing and crazy that night was, the fire was on one side of a 4-lane freeway, and the next thing you know, we start getting calls on the other side of this 4-lane freeway from people's houses burning, whose houses were burning down. And as we're dispatching them out, units are coming up and going, that's impossible, the fire was just on the other side of the freeway, can you check the location? I think you have the location wrong. But in fact, there were fires on the other side of the freeway. That fire had crossed 4 lanes of freeway and was now burning down an entire neighborhood on
It
the other
took
side.
the overpass. Like, how rude is that? It took the overpass. Besides the Embercast, it took the overpass, which is crazy, but go ahead.
Yeah, so we were, again, when you're behind a computer screen, and as a dispatcher creates what we call an event or a call, it pops onto all of our maps. So as I'm sitting there in front of my own personal consoles, I see red dots popping up all over everywhere. And literally at any given point, we had what looked like hundreds and hundreds of active fires. And so looking at this screen, it was unbelievable. It was hard to wrap our minds around the magnitude of what was happening. And then also what you have to keep in mind, like you said, 911 dispatchers are also first responders. So what we're hearing are cries of help, chaos, confusion, but also we are experiencing the disaster along with our community because we all live here. And so at one point of the night, and it all blurs because it was so hellacious, the volume, the speed of everything that was moving. And then at the same time, I'm thinking, I left my family, my husband and our 2 young twins at home. The fire looked like it was moving towards our town too. So you're thinking about your own family, you're thinking about the community. And at one point I'm working and I look over and the dispatcher next to me, my coworker, has tears just streaming down his face. And I'm thinking, because it was really stressful, so I was thinking the stress is getting to all of us. And what he had just learned was that his house was burning down in that moment. So as he is working at the dispatch center that night, his house burned down. And that story is not unique to us in the dispatch setting. We had doctors, paramedics, firemen who, as they were working to help the community, their own personal houses, their families were in jeopardy. And so they're serving the community and also taking personal loss at the same time. So it was just a crazy night that I will never forget because it completely changed how I looked at my future and what I wanted to do with it.
So you go through this really terrible experience, and I think I really love the fact that, I don't love the fact that there was trauma inside of the dispatch, but I do think it's so important that people understand that first responders often lose too in these situations, and they are traumatized, and that we have to take care of first responders. And as we take care of our community, it's got to include the entire community, including post-traumatic stress therapy and release interventions to help take care of them. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because often the public turns to the public turns to the public sector and they say, you have to fix this, and I'm upset you have to also take on all of that. And the people who are taking on all of that are also holding their own trauma and their own experience and often their own loss. So
that is so true. So true.
Yeah.
And I think that an important element is that this goes on for a long period of time, because the first few nights of the fire, we're in that mode, but for the month and a half, 2 months afterward, our dispatch center did not work like the way it normally did. And then people started feeling and processing their trauma at different times. And so we had, as a staff, as a dispatch center, we had to be able to not only continue to serve the community, but bounce back and try to make do with what we had, because at different points, people had to take time off because of mental health. People had to take time off because they lost their property. And at the same time, we're still continuing to do our job that we did every day. So it was, layer on layer of having to learn to cope.
So talk to us then about, how do you turn that hellacious experience into something so useful? I gave an intro, and in the intro, I talked about how you then went on to leave a career that you really loved, to start this organization to serve vulnerable communities, in particular the Latinx and senior community. So did you go home and talk to your husband and say, this is what I want to do, and take us like I think the human story is so important in the direction of how to disaster, because it's all done by humans. So
it is. And I think at first I didn't really know what was going to come of it. It's kind of, I always kind of want to look at it as a phoenix rising moment in my life where out of the fire, this beautiful thing arose. And so I felt like after what we talked about, the trauma of it afterward didn't really hit me personally until about a month later. And so what had happened the day that it really hit me in full, and I started I felt like I gave birth to this thing, but I didn't know I was in labor yet. And so that first month, I kind of started feeling this thing in my stomach and my gut, this like churning. And I was like, okay, but I felt like it was the emotion of everything that was happening. There was part of a road that was shut down, that overpass that you were talking about, that they had the nerve to overtake. Well, there was a mobile home park that burnt down right there in that corner. And it was called Journeys in Mobile Home Park, of all the names, right? But it was a senior mobile home park. And as a dispatch center, we took calls from there all the time for the 17 years prior to the fire. There was calls there daily. People are older, they have issues. So I had a relationship to that community that I didn't really even know I was aware I had. Seniors, vulnerable, a lot of health issues. The first time they opened that road, prior to that, I'd had to drive to work what I called the long way. I had to go around, and I didn't get to see that area for about a month. When they opened that up, the first night I drove to work and actually drove in front of the park and saw it completely burnt down. All these houses, rows and rows of houses were gone, burnt to the ground. And something happened when I saw that park that I barely was able to roll into our dispatch parking lot, which is only a block away. And I completely had a meltdown. For the first time since the fire, I had overflowing emotions that I couldn't control. I was crying. I called up to my supervisor and said, I'm in the parking lot, but I need some time. And what hit me was that here was this vulnerable population that for 17 years I felt I had been protecting and helping. And that night there was nothing I can do for them. There weren't even resources that I could send them because everybody was busy with the fire and other emergencies. And what I realized in that night is that I was not in that chair just to witness this event, but to do something different about it, to make a change, to move the needle, so that this particular level of unpreparedness and chaos did not happen again for all of our community, especially our vulnerable. And so that, I believe, was the catalyst that night, that realization that I need to take what I learned, what I saw, what I'm feeling right now, this sense of loss. I need to take it and make something good out of it. And so I started thinking of an organization. I started thinking about wanting to do this type of work. And right away, almost instinctually, I wanted to do a nonprofit where I can direct the work in the way I knew it needed to go. And so I kind of chewed on it for a few months. And then I finally got brave enough to approach my husband because, like you said, I was in this wonderful career almost 20 years in that I love doing, serving the community. And so now I wanted this bright idea to stop doing that I've been doing and start this new thing, which I wasn't even sure if it was going to work or how was it going to go, but this is what I wanted to do. So I approached my husband, and surprisingly, he almost already knew it was coming, because of the talk and because of what he saw, kind of this metamorphosis happen in front of his face. And so when I said I want to start a nonprofit, I want to do disaster preparedness to all communities, especially our vulnerable population. I want to do 911 awareness. I want to teach the community and give them the tools that they need for not just disasters, but other safety and health events, because this is what I feel like I need to do. I'm guided to that. And so we spent almost a year forming the nonprofit, at which time we started doing the work, doing the bylaws, forming the board, doing all the things we needed to do. And then we received our 501c3 in November of 2018. And in February, on my birthday of 2019, I resigned my position as a dispatcher. At that point, almost 20 years in, and walked away from that, but to fully embrace the work I was doing through Nuestra Comunidad. And that's where I've been.
So with Nuestra Comunidad, can you, so tell us how you decided on your your bucket specifically, because when you say vulnerable, there's so much need in a vulnerable population. But, you know, I like to say we were early adopters of Alma Bowen and your vision, because we've been big believers, and you see great people with good ideas that you believe that you should invest in. And you were an easy decision for us because of your passion and your experience. But tell us, like, or tell the audience, how did you decide, you know, what particular vulnerable populations, what is the population here in Sonoma County that, not that you only work here, but primarily you work here, that you wanted, and what exactly did you want them to know in order to help them stay safer and be more resilient?
That's a great question. And so when I saw vulnerable populations, I looked at historically who's most affected in disasters, and that was reflected in our own loss. You know, we lost people during that fire, and historically it's the older people because they're by themselves, they have mobility problems, they're not connected, they don't, you know, they weren't aware of what to do. So the senior population was somebody that right away, and especially with my experience with that mobile home park, it brought it home to me that that's where some serious loss happens. And then I thought, in the moment of disasters, where did I see the holes? And interestingly enough, one of the biggest holes that was like screaming out at me is that although we did receive calls from Spanish only speakers, proportionately, we were receiving a lot less calls than what we should have received for the impact that it had on that community. And it spoke to the bigger problem that they were afraid to access the 911 system. And so, as much as the people that did access, and how can I help them better understand how to prepare and connect and make sure they're getting alerts, was like, who isn't accessing and why? And, you know, what are the fears, the walls that I can break down so that they're not afraid to use a system that's here to help them. And so the Latinx, primarily Spanish speaking community, and the seniors were my first two groups that I knew from impact that I saw that night that needed, that I wanted to outreach to and make sure I was reaching. But then the community as a whole, because when disaster strikes, it didn't matter from Fountain Grove, which is a more affluent area, to Coffee Park, which is, you know, middle upper class. The disaster hits everybody the same. But then some of the other holes I saw was in disaster recovery. Not everybody recovers the same. And so being able to help them prepare, but then look at what can you also do to make sure that you build your resiliency so you can recover from disasters. So part of what we teach along with disaster preparedness is also what can you do to make sure you have, you know, maybe some funds put away for a disaster time, renter's insurance, so that if you lose everything you own during a fire, but you don't actually own your property, but you can get moving and go on with your life. A lot of the people that I learned of that after the disaster never recovered and had to actually move out of the area were renters that did not have renter's insurance or any kind of savings. So when that disaster hit, they just couldn't lift themselves out of that.
And
so
most of them, though, they don't, unless you know, people go on with their lives, and we're normal, so we hope for the best. We don't always prepare for the worst, but renter's insurance can be as little as like $10 a month, and you can do it on your phone.
yes.
You know, and I just have to put that plug in there that if you are a renter and you are hearing this, or you have friends that are renters, you've got to tell them to get renter's insurance, because it is the difference. And also videotape your home.
Yes.
You know, you can do it in pictures, that's fine. But if you walk around for 10 minutes and just videotape your home at the beginning of each fire season, you'll be so much happier at the end, if should you lose your home. But I just want to plug that. Keep going, keep on rolling. You're doing great.
No, and that's true. You know, it's even the simple things. And that was another thing that's so striking, is that disaster preparedness is not particularly laboring extensive or difficult. But yet so many people, even now, I still get shocked. 3 years into doing this work, I'm out in community. Even during COVID, I remained out in community as much as I could, doing outreach around COVID, but also continuing disaster preparedness, awareness, and outreach. And people, you know, we're 4 fires in Sonoma County, and some people are still not prepared. They don't have their communication plan. They don't have a disaster plan. They don't have an evacuation plan. They don't have their go bag. They don't have their stay home box. Like all the essential elements, they still don't have it. So how do we encourage and motivate, or even help get community members from point A, knowing that they need to do this, to point B and actually doing it? And I believe that takes continued engagement and that building relationships. And also the bigger picture, one of our hashtags is disaster resilience minded. That's one of them. And also a culture of preparedness. So I believe that becoming prepared, being prepared, is going to be a cultural shift that needs to happen. And so I do a lot of work at schools, everything from kindergarten up to high school, different levels of disaster and 911 awareness. But I think if we start getting it in when they're children, I want to build a culture of preparedness where conversations around preparedness, actually preparing, taking the steps necessary is just part of what we do. And so we don't think of it as this weird thing on the side. We think of it as just something we do.
We're not talking bunkers. I mean, if you want to bunker it out, we're not stopping you. I don't think it's really going to help you in a wildfire. So I think that there was almost like a stigma attached to being prepared, that somehow then we're all hoarding guns too. And we're not talking about that. It's actually not even true that in the midst of a disaster that people pick up guns and start shooting each other and hoarding their food. It's actually they start sharing their food, they put down their guns, and they help each other out. I mean, COVID was a bit of a misnomer, but the rest of it is true. That when you were talking about schools, I just remembered sitting with you in my office a couple of years ago, and you talking about how you also wanted kids to go home to their families and say, hey, what's our disaster plan? How are we prepared? So can you talk about that a little bit? Because there's that double bonus there, changing the culture, but also using, kids as a pathway in a good way for better safety preparedness with their parents.
Absolutely. And I even would sweeten the pot a little bit, and it doesn't take much with kids. I would get water bottles or, an item. And so when I would do a presentation in a class, I would give them a draft of a disaster plan. And I would say, the first 10 kids that bring this back to your teacher, I'm leaving these with her or him. And then the first 10 students that come back with a copy of their plan will go home and talk to your parents and tell them you need to sit down and make a plan. And then you're going to get a water bottle, or I would get like a cool lunchbox that they could use for their little kid, things like that. And so I had teachers involved in it, and the smallest thing, a little water bottle, radio, anything that they feel is a prize or acknowledgement. And then we'd always have a commitment certificate. I would have them sign a little pledge that they were going to become preparedness ambassadors to their families. And I would put a sticker on it.
I like that. Put a pin in that.
Yeah.
Preparedness ambassadors. Like,
they loved it.
Perfect.
And they loved it because it's like, oh, I'm going to do that, And then I would say, and if you're my preparedness ambassador, then you're going to get a prize. Plus, we're going to put your certificate up on the wall. Just little things like that. And so teachers would say, like, their kids would totally do it. And so that's all it took. It's making them a part of it, making them an ambassador, giving them a role, giving them a responsibility. You go home and you teach your family. They loved it. And we're talking kids as small as kindergarten. They're totally able to reach into their own family and talk to them. And if you have a language barrier, normally like primarily Spanish speaking only parents, that children and I know this from my own lived experience, when we were in school, we were the ones that brought all the information home to our parents, because my parents to this day only speak Spanish. And so we actually were the ones bringing the information home. And so it works for whether you're a Spanish speaker or not, but in those situations, those parents are actually relying on the students to bring home the information. And so all the kids became really active in it. And I could see the growth just in the years. COVID totally put a kibosh on my school outreach, but in the years I did it, from kindergarten to first or second grade, after a while, the kids can start telling you the elements of preparedness, or they'd see me and they're like, oh, it's the emergency lady or the 911 lady, or, but so they started relating who I was into what we were going to talk about. And so it was exciting developing curriculums that were age appropriate, but then also, we were trying to crack the nut of how do we engage junior high and high school students, because they're a totally different beast than, elementary school. And so we're bringing on a resilience leadership component where we're going to engage with high schools with their juniors and seniors around preparedness, around resilience work, but also connect them to EMS so that they find out about careers in EMS. So fire, police, EMTs, like, you know, right now it's a program that we're looking to fund. It's brand new, but that's going to be a really good way to engage with college, with high school age students, because they don't want to hear just that somebody come in and talk to them. They want to be involved, and they want to see how can it relate to them. And you know,
everybody likes to be somebody in front of somebody else. So I love that, and I love that you're going to go into junior high and high schools, because certainly, you know, they too can be ambassadors and very engaged in it. I think one of the reasons why we've always really liked what you do is we felt like you really meet people where they're at, and so much about disaster work has to be to say, what do you need and how can I help? And then you decide what your programs will look like. We think a lot of philanthropy is a little bit broken in that sense, that instead it's like, here's what I think you need, and so here's what I'm going to fund, and so create it from there. And we liked your approach to going into, you know, the biculturalism is incredibly important. The Spanish speaking is incredibly important, really pushing to make sure that all public entities release information in Spanish and English at the same time, that's a priority, and in ways that can actually be delivered, you know, because it's not always the same. And so if you could just talk to us about first your approach with the Latinx community, and you know, and also understanding the Latinx community isn't just like one block with one answer, you know, that's just not the case. There's tons of diversity there, but how did you decide your programming? And what's really important for people to know who may not know anything about that community, and they're trying to figure out how to serve a community that is not, you know, is bicultural and bilingual. We'll start there, and then we're going to go to seniors.
Absolutely. And I think it's having a feedback loop. You have to have the ability, and one of our philosophies is what we call a push and a pull. So there's always information that you're trying, or training you're trying to push out into the community, but just as, if not more important, is what you're pulling back, the information you're pulling from that community. And so even though I myself am a Latina, you know, that came here to the United States as a very small child, I recognized early on that my experience was different. You know, even though I had a lot of commonality to and we're talking specifically to servicing the Latinx community. So Latinx doesn't just mean you only speak Spanish or English. There is a gamut of indigenous languages that I myself don't speak. So even for me, that's been a nut that I'm trying to still actively not only understand, but respect. You cannot approach a community without acknowledging who they are, respecting in full who they are, their autonomy. And if you can't approach it that way, it's going to come off ingenuine, and they're going to read it right away, and that disengages people right off the bat. So coming in with that humility and being humble enough to say, look, I don't fully understand how to approach your culture. Can you please help me understand? And what is it that you need, and how can I meet that need? You know, you asking. I was surprised early on how off I was, even with what I had as understanding, some of the times how off I could be in what I thought people needed, and missed, you know, was blind as to what some of the needs are. An example of that is I started doing, when COVID hit, I started doing these tailgate trainings, talking to vineyard and field workers about COVID safety, because that we had a huge outbreak in our Latinx community, a lot of which were our farm and vineyard workers, and we were trying to help with that. And so one of my first trainings, I was giving them all the information, and then at the end, I always ask for feedback. So this is, again, that feedback loop, and that, you know, taking away with you as much as what you bring. And I said, can somebody share with me what are the obstacles for you to stay safe from COVID? And this young gentleman raised his hand and said, I don't have enough cloth masks. They give me this disposable mask at work, but when I go home, I don't wear it. I've been wearing it all day at work, and it's dirty, and I don't have money to go get masks. So I need cloth masks I can rewash and wear. here I am giving this presentation with materials and stuff, and I don't have masks to give them. So I had obviously missed the ball on that. So after that, I left, went and got some masks, came back to that crew, gave them masks. And then from then on, every time I did COVID outreach or training, I made sure I had PPEs with me, masks, sanitizers, everything that somebody would need to stay safe, and acknowledge that maybe access to these things were actually a bigger problem than information. They understood it, but they didn't have access. And so,
but you also, I remember talking to you about this, you know, while this was going on, and you said that you learned something really important too, that they weren't putting the masks on until they got to work. But they, you know, it's very common for farm workers to carpool. It's more common than not. And so they were picking each other up and then riding to work, and then putting their masks on. Meanwhile, they'd been in close contact for that entire period. So and that you were able to figure that out through your feedback loop and address that concern. So I want to give you props. I don't want to miss that prop, because I was like, oh, yeah, for me too.
No, and it was. And if you think about it, there would be, you know, at any given point, 4 to 6 men or women in a vehicle from 4 to 6 households, now all sharing the space and then going back and sharing with their family when they went home. And so, hello, you know, talk about a fast rate of spread, you know, you're gonna, that was a big contributor too.
And there was no intention. They weren't like, oh, we don't care. It wasn't that at all. It was just that sometimes you just need somebody to be like, hey, you need to put, you know, it would actually help if you put it on when you know, before you got in the vehicle, because people are just trying to live and survive. And so just that's an example where I once again saw you meet the community exactly, you know, where they're at, and not tell them what they should need, but you heard it, you listened, and then you pivoted and met the moment. So I love that. Can you talk to us about, one thing before we move to seniors, because I think seniors is so important, especially in disasters. But with the Latinx community, there's always an issue of sheltering during a disaster, never worse than during COVID. But let's take COVID out of the equation for long-term disaster, for how-to disaster. And let's say that we won't have this horrible pandemic forever. And, you know, what we found was that a lot of the undocumented Latinx population, Latinx population wouldn't go to our shelters because they actually thought, well, ICE will be there. And they weren't wrong in 2017, because the head of ICE got on national television and said that an undocumented person started our massive wildfires, which was completely not true. And our sheriff had to actually respond to that. And he did. Sheriff Giordano did a beautiful job basically saying that's a complete lie. However, it's an ongoing issue. And recently I had Nancy Brown on from the county of Sonoma talking about the signage that they created for all the shelters. And one of the things that we talked about was, well, that's great, but how are they, then they have to get all the way to the shelter before they would know that immigration won't be there. So they've already made that decision. So if you're meeting them where they're at, then you probably need to figure out a way for them to have that information in advance, and you know, that sort of thing. So can you talk about the special needs of the undocumented population?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is often missed is that in a lot of households, we have mixed documentation too. So we have mixed statuses. So the majority of the family could have some type of legal status, but they have the one relative or the one person or just somebody in that household that is not. And that actually puts that whole family in that stance because they're afraid for their loved one. And so that whole family would make the whole choice, even if most of them didn't feel threatened by ICE or not. And so I think understanding that most households have some level of mixed status when it comes to immigration is important, because that is actually more accurate. But also I think that making, at least for NC, part of what we talk about during disaster prep in general, when I'm talking to a Latinx community, knowing your audience and making sure that I'm addressing that fear ahead of time. And telling them that in California, it's illegal for ICE to come in and do their ICE duties at a shelter. Now, although there is no guarantee ever, because we cannot guarantee that it would never happen. But we do advocate for, like, during that time, that's still the safest place for you to be at. But also on the other side of it, what we have to recognize and plan for is that normally places that are not designated as shelters, but are places that the Latinx community feels comfortable at, this is where they're going to show up to during disasters, whether it's a designated shelter or not. So how about we make sure that those places are ready to receive the population and work with them, and maybe having those, even if they're unofficial, well-equipped, well-trained shelters that people can feel comfortable going to, and that we can receive them in the way they need to be received. So that's
and I want to give an example of how this went horribly wrong in Sonoma Valley, and both horribly right and horribly wrong, because we obviously we were surrounded by fire, so we had to create our own food systems. And there were 3 shelters downtown Sonoma, and 2 of them were occupied by very physically compromised disabled people from Sonoma Developmental Center and the staff. Mm-hmm. And then the 3rd one was a general one. But there was nothing in the Springs where I live, nothing. And in fact, there was, like, official people other than police and fire wouldn't even go out there, except for Congressman Mike Thompson. So I'm always going to give him that prop. We were left very much on our own. And, there are 15,000 people, and over 50% of them are Latinx. So, and about 27% are undocumented, and that means that many of them live in mixed status households. But what we found is many of them are sheltered in place, so we had to figure out a trusted organization. So churches are good. I'm on the board of La Luz, and La Luz is a resource center, and so they could push out information, and they opened up, like, essentially a care station where they could feed and provide diapers. Diapers are always a good idea. Don't send your old clothes, send diapers. I'd like to note that. But then at the same time, there was another school in our district called El Verano Community School. And Maite Aturi, who's one of my favorite people on the planet, she's a trusted leader. She has a family resource center. So we helped her, and she opened a care center where people could come get what they needed. And the school district shut it down after about 3 days because they didn't want to deal with it. And it was infuriating because they had this opportunity. There was a commercial kitchen there. They could have easily served a large portion of vulnerable population. And it was just, no, I don't want to deal with it. And it was incredibly disappointing, and it was a missed opportunity. And now we have 3 schools in the Springs that are certified. You can get your schools certified by the Red Cross and the counties in advance, because you cannot expect people to go to places, especially in a place like downtown Sonoma, that's mostly white and well-resourced and wealthy, and it's where people go to work, and it's not where people go for comfort. And I just want to, maybe some people won't like it that I'm being so frank about that, but get certified now for your trusted and churches, resource centers, schools, has to be said.
No, it does. And I think it's really important. And I think that there's a point where we can work together on this. So an example, during the Kincaid fire, the Hillsburg Community Center was the first evacuation center. And so Corazon Hillsburg, who's an organization that does a lot of work with the Latinx community in that area, is already housed there, and they have daycares there. So they were already on site. So when Red Cross came in, I got pulled in as a partner of Corazon, and we actually had a presence there and worked alongside with the Red Cross to provide, when they walked in the door, there was a whole table of Spanish-speaking volunteers to welcome. 95% of the people that showed up at that center were Spanish-only speakers. And so being able to welcome them, give with a trusted face that they knew, made all the difference where people were coming in and staying, And
that was what we learned we learned that between October of 2017 and October of 2019. So that was progress. And so you don't have to be perfect, but you do have to aim for progress.
Absolutely. And so now, one of the things is how do we get more, like you said, churches, resource centers, schools, designated as, partners in sheltering people during disasters, because that's where people are going to go that are not feeling comfortable in the regular. You can tell people, and I do make it part of my training and my outreach to let them know, hey, you're safer there than anywhere. Because we have had circumstances where people aren't safe, feeling safe. So then they go off somewhere, and then they don't have food, they don't have resource, they don't have shelter. They're, we don't even know where they're at. So they could be at risk and we don't even know. So that's not safe either, And so it's still a lot of progress, but I think, like you said, we're making progress and we have to continue to move in that direction.
We do. So I'd like to turn now to the special needs of seniors. Seniors are possibly the most vulnerable besides the disabled in a disaster. They are the least likely to rebuild after a disaster. There are all kinds of issues. We tend to have our wildfires coincide with massive power shutoffs for obvious reasons. During the 2017 fires, we didn't have power for 10 days, and other places didn't have power sometimes for up to 3 weeks. And then during Kincade, we actually had a cold snap, in addition to a 6-day PS of a public safety power shutoff. So this is not an unusual morbidity, if you want to call it that. Seniors often have medication that has to be refrigerated. And it's little things too. Unfortunately, in 2017, we had seniors who died in their homes and often in their garages. So California passed a law that my friend Cheryl Dean made sure happened through State Senator Bill Dodd's office, that said that anytime you buy a new home, it has to have a battery backup. But most homes, we don't build that many homes except during disaster, which means that for most of us, can you get out of your garage with your car? If you are a senior in particular, for anybody, pull your car out of the garage if you're in the middle of a red flag warning, if you are concerned at all, face it towards the road. And with seniors, this is just, your neighbors, check on them. And, so I wanted you to go into your wonderful work with, I love your stories about working with senior communities, but I did want to make a plug for really do not leave your car in the garage during a red flag warning, because maybe one of you can open up the garage without power, but maybe the other one can't. And what if one, very important, especially if you're a senior or you are disabled in any way. So can you talk about your work with senior communities? Because it's so awesome.
It is, it's part of that jewel, in your cap, the highlight. And it's interestingly enough, one of the best projects I've worked with you guys. You guys funded me to do some work around a low-income senior facility in Santa Rosa. So one of the tenants called and said, we're a low-income senior facility, but we're on our own. Like, we get low-income apartments, but nobody's here helping us. And she was afraid, because what's happening is a lot of seniors are very isolated. Many of them, their families don't live in this area, so they don't have people checking on them. They don't have people helping them prepare their kids or even knowing what to do. And then the digital divide that we see is an issue with some of our Latinx community, is also an issue with our senior community. Most of them, if they have a cell phone, only use it to make calls. Many of them don't even text on it. They're learning more, and some of them are more adept, but in general, I found they were very limited in their access to technology. And so this woman named Sue called and said, we're afraid. A lot of us survived, obviously, the Tubbs fire, but some of us were displaced at that time and ended up here. Nobody's helping us. We want information. So I went in and did a series of disaster preparedness presentations with disaster plans. And what started happening was pretty cool. So I did a presentation. The first group of about 15 seniors showed up for the first one. And I had a series of 6 scheduled out. The next series, the next time I did it, it was going to be the same series 6 times to make sure everybody had a time slot they can attend. The second one, everybody that came for the first one came back again, even though they'd already covered the information. And then we had maybe another 15 new people. So then we had 30. The next one, the room was full. The next one, it was, people kept coming back. But then beyond that, what happened is that they all did their plans. We talked about communications. I helped them sign up to alerts and understand alerting. We talked about people that had medications that needed to be refrigerated, things that we can do. How do we work our way around that for PS when our powers are shut off for the PSPSs? But then what happened is that I had a core group of about 12 to 15 seniors. This is 70-year-old plus seniors that wanted to form their own version of disaster preparedness, like their version of COPE, which is citizens organized to prepare for emergencies, but they called it ROPE, residents organized to prepare for emergencies. So every week I would meet with them. They had a board, they had a committee, they formed this all themselves. I just facilitated. We had a list of priorities of things we're going to cover, from how to use a fire extinguisher. So I was pulling in the fire department to come in and help me train. But these people, these ladies and a couple of gentlemen, all 70 plus, became so driven in not only keeping themselves safe, but their neighbors safe, and making sure that everybody would be able to get out of that building. And we were addressing, like, if there is an emergency, because a lot of them don't drive. So they were like, how are we going to get out of here? They're not providing a public transportation. So we were looking at, what are you going to do? But it was incredible to see. And to me, it speaks to that whole culture of preparedness within this little community that was one time scared, anxious, anxiety ridden, became this empowered community that had a plan. We're working together on helping each other. Now that is like fantastic. That's the dream right there, is to have communities within themselves that can help one another. Because during disasters, the first 72 hours, that's who you're going to rely on. If you cannot get out of your area, your neighbors, your friends, those are the people that are actually going to help you. And so to see this in this older community and to see their confidence level go from point A to point B was amazing. So COVID kind of put a stop to the meetings, but now that things are getting opened up a little bit, we're starting to talk about reinstating the meetings and having them continue with their list of priorities. But that was a perfect example. And seniors, oftentimes their adult children don't live in the area. Some of them don't have adult children. They're all on fixed incomes. A lot of them don't understand the new language, the new developments, and so they feel really lost. And during
and
disaster,
I would like to make a point of saying that I'm always a little bit amazed at how hard programs like yours are to fund publicly. Like, you're not asking to become a multimillionaire off of Nuestra Comunidad. But you are asking, just, or I'm going to ask for you, even though you're not saying it, to say, it would be nice if I knew where my next 3 to 5 years of funding was coming from. And if I could hire within the community to actually multiply my effect, so that we knew that every senior community, low income or not, but in particular low income, was actually prepared and there was some kind of plan. It seems to me that you should always be fully funded in that way. You are doing a service that is critical and builds confidence and resiliency, like one, micro community at a time. So you may not say it, but I'm going to say it. You can, you can follow a link to donate to Alma.
No, thank you. And that's often the hard part. That's the rub. It's like right now with Nuestra Comunidad, we're really looking at building capacity, because this momentum of disaster work is not stopping. If anything, it's increasing. And so there's 1,000 of those communities that need that. And like you said, whether they're low income or not, that community happened to have reached out to me because there was such a level of anxiety that they were talking amongst themselves, and they sought me out because they heard about the work I was doing. But there's 1,000 communities like that need that level of involvement to get them on the right track, to help build a system that they can function in, to become more resilient themselves. Because that's ultimately the goal. I can't be everywhere. The fire department can't be everywhere. Police department cannot be everywhere. During a disaster, guess what? You're on your own. And that is a reality that I learned in 2017. That was the hardest pill for me as a responder to swallow. And that's the stuff that keeps us awake at night as responders.
For sure. And it's also shocking until you go through a disaster, how many gaps of opportunity exist. And it's not that people don't care. It's just that, you don't fund what you haven't seen yet. You don't prioritize something that hasn't happened yet. And if there's no history or memory attached to it, then it can be very difficult to be like, this is something we should do. But we are entering, an era of pretty major disasters. Last year was the worst disaster year on record for FEMA. There were 20 $1 billion or over disasters just in 2020. And they counted all of our wildfires across the Western United States as one of those 20. And that's $16.5 billion in damage, and over 10 million acres were burned. I just was on a conference this morning, and 2021 is forecast to be perhaps even worse. And we are not alarmists. In fact, we are people who stay pretty mellow in the face of disaster, because we know that we have to be the leaders. But we want to encourage everyone to, develop leadership in that area and resiliency in that area, and to, if you can help to fund it, if you can, in some way participate, or at least make sure that you don't have to call 911, or don't think FEMA is going to come in and save you, because they are really they need you to be on your own for about 72 hours. And even then, it's a very slow process. So I love the work that you do, and I know that it's time for us to wrap up, but I'm hoping that you can leave us with some final thoughts on, if somebody's sitting in Nevada, and they're thinking, about wildfire or another type of disaster, or Idaho, for example. There are thousands of vulnerable communities, and they're thinking, what small step can I take to help my community be more resilient? Can you talk about that?
Yes, I always tell, because oftentimes people, when they hear this story, they ask like, well, what can I do right now? It's often hard to put yourself in a disaster mode when you're not in it. But I would say, make the partnerships now. Connect, think about, if you're a government organization, or if you're with the disaster office in your area and you're involved in disaster response, before a disaster hits, think of the connections, the community partners that you have to already have maybe a contract and understanding with beforehand, so that when that disaster hits, those things are already in place, and you're not trying to reinvent the wheel in the middle of the disaster. That's been thought through. Everybody understands the role, because the community is the one that gets the better product in that situation. The community benefits from you understanding that you can't do it, so let me reach out, figure out who can, and make sure that they're on board, and that they are partners in this, and that we all have a plan on how we're going to respond for the community.
And that you're ready to put out, if you have a significant population that is non-English speaking, ensure that you have translators already on contract, that you are ready to push out the information at the same time, not 2 days later, not a week later, not an hour later. But, if you want people to feel prioritized, you actually have to prioritize them. And, don't miss your opportunities with seniors, because Alma, I've heard that story now probably 6 times, and I absolutely never tire of it, because I just love it.
No, it's my favorite. It's, when I look back at the work I've done this far, that's one of the projects that just makes me feel like I'm in the right space doing the right work. And to speak to that, making sure you're responding to the language component, don't ever also assume that if you have a bilingual employee, that employee can actually translate. Please hire a trained translator and have them already. This is one of the contracts I'm talking about that you want to get in place beforehand. That employee should not be tasked with duties like that they're not trained to do. And then again, the community is the one that suffers. You put out information that is not correctly translated, it could cause a bigger issue already. And then making sure that you're going to trained interpreters. There's an entire code of ethics behind interpreting. I was a medical interpreter also, and I had most of what I learned in that training was actually the code of ethics that comes with that. And if you're missing that, you're opening yourself to liability, and also you're doing a disservice to the community that you're serving.
Well, Alma, I've always been a big Alma fan, and nothing about today has changed that. And I hope that this podcast creates even more fans. And I really appreciate you as my colleague and my friend, and also someone that I know that I can always reach out to and lean on in times that are have disaster or not. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me here. And also thank you for being one of the very first people in this county that believed in what we were doing and put your money where your mouth was, to be honest. When we came into it, it's the partnerships, like your partnership was critical in getting us on our feet. So thank you.
My pleasure. Are you kidding? We were fortunate to do it. So thank you.
Fannie Mae, the largest provider of mortgage finance in the U.S., owns 1 out of every 4 loans in the country. You can find out if Fannie Mae owns your mortgage at knowyouroptions.com by using our loan lookup tool. This last year has been quite difficult, and making your mortgage payments could be too. There are options for those available that may have experienced a natural disaster such as wildfire or the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the options available is a forbearance plan, where homeowners are given a period of reduced or suspended payments to manage a temporary hardship of financial standing. For this caused by natural disaster or COVID-19 pandemic, you could be eligible for a 6-month extension with a possibility of another 6 months after that. During the forbearance plan, the homeowner is not charged late fees. If you received additional living expense assistance after your disaster, and those funds have run out, you still may be eligible to apply for a forbearance plan. When your forbearance plan ends, your lending or servicer will contact you to see if you need assistance or are ready to resume making your normal scheduled mortgage payments. If you don't hear from them, you should proactively reach out. If you are unable to repay the balance in its entirety, you may arrange a repayment plan, or if eligible, qualify for other programs such as a payment deferral or flex modification. A payment deferral allows you to bring your mortgage current. This option keeps your monthly mortgage payment the same as it was before your hardship, and the total deferred amount will be due on the last scheduled payment of the loan. Should you sell or refinance, the deferred balance is included in the remaining amount due. Flex modification is Fannie Mae's standard modification. It provides 20% principal and interest payment reduction on your mortgage. Once the modification is complete, the loan's term is extended to 40 years. Depending on the circumstances, the modification may result in a reduction of interest rate and/or principal forbearance. What is a principal forbearance, by the way? And that's when a portion of the unpaid principal balance, basically the remaining loan amount, is put into an interest-free balance secured by the loan as part of the flex modification. It can be modified by the maturity date or with an early payoff. More information is available at knowyouroptions.com. When ready to request mortgage assistance, reach out to your mortgage company. This is the company you send your payments to each month, and you'll find that phone number on your mortgage statement. Additional relief assistance is available through our disaster response network. Here, impacted homeowners can work with HUD-approved housing counselors to get help requesting financial relief through FEMA, insurance claims, and more. Homeowners can visit knowyouroptions.com/relief for more information or call 877-833-1746. Once again, 877-833-1746 or knowyouroptions.com.
Thank you for joining us on How to Disaster, a playbook to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. I want to leave you with this one thought. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we want you to know that you can get through this. You can recover, rebuild, and reimagine. But there's only one way you're going to do it, and that's together.